welcome all. Thanks for the phenomenal attendance. Trust you can all hear me relatively clearly. I'll try and speak as clearly as I can do. So the title speaks for itself, Competency in Wind Energy. So for many of you that may or may not know, Scanware have been running webinar series now, I think at the start of COVID, so start of 2020 we launched them, and largely they've been centered around electrical safety. And as many of you will be aware. Now, I've known Chris Streatfeild for quite a number of years. He'll make an intro just in a few moments. What I think was a stark reminder, which I'll cover off in the slide in a few moments, but is the correlation between good safety practices, good safety results and achievements within an organization, how closely that's linked with competency and training. And what was concerning me was, particularly from an electrical perspective, was the rise in incidents within the wind energy sector. And furthermore, when you see the renewable growth ambitions of most major countries around the world, you start thinking, where are the people going to come from to physically install and maintain this kind of infrastructure? And with massive scale-ups with people, there always comes the risk, and that risk is competency. So yes, Chris will be covering off a presentation which is quite wide in its bearing, but we launched it particularly targeted at wind energy. Let's move forward, Ben. So you will receive a copy of the slides, and also a recording of the event will be sent around to every single one that registered, which is good news. So for whatever reason you need to drop off, or for those obviously that aren't on here but they're registered, then they'll get a recording they can look at post-event. You will receive a little survey at the end, almost immediately after the seminar, and it'd be really good if you could just give us some real candid feedback as to how you think the presentation's been, so we can keep improving. And we're switching this webinar up. We've got a speaker missing, which is Stephen Rose from SSE, and which I'm sorry that is not on, and so is he, but his work pressures have got the better. He said he was going to try and join on to attend and support where possible. So because of that, because there's a lot of talent within those that have registered, we're going to finish early, and we're going to open up a truly live Q&A. What we mean by that is, for those of you who may or may not be aware, there is a raise hand button at the bottom of the Zoom panel, and you can physically or virtually raise your hand on screen, and we will unmute you, and we can try and get a bit of a virtual conversation going. So we've never done this before, and we're going to see how it goes. So when we get towards the end, don't be shy, pitch in. Let's keep moving, Ben. We're going to set some panelists. Chris Streatfeild, he'll give his own intro in a few moments. Myself, an ambassador for saving lives. Let's keep moving, Ben. Do any of you know what this number means? 560,000. If you do, why don't you just drop a little message in the chat if you know what this 560,000 mean? For any of you that are in or around the wind energy sector, you might have a bit of an inkling. I'll give 5 seconds for people just to stick into their chat box if they know what 560,000 means. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so within the wind energy sector, there are varying organizations, but two of the major organizations within wind is the GWO, which is the Global Wind Organization, and also GWEC, which is the Global Wind Energy Council. And last week, they published a report, and what they're saying is between 2022 and 2026, within the renewable wind energy sector globally, there will be a need for over 560,000 technicians. 560. There you are, Liam Hicks. Superb. Thank you. And it's staggering, really. And to be fair, these results were published after we launched the idea of this event. And what it clearly shows and states, if you move on one slide, then this is the actual text from the report. So it's widely available online. The Global Wind Force Outlook, which was created by GWEC and GWO, they say it highlights an urgent need for faster growth in safety and technical training capacity to meet the current gaps in supply. Because when you've got a scale up like that, understandably, with it comes risk. And if you move on one slide, Ben. So the G+, they produce some statistics for 2021, which again, many of you may or may not be aware of. And what this data shows, which is theirs, it shows really the high potential hazards and occurrences that are happening within the wind sector. So there was a 10% growth in 2021 to what there was in 2020 in working with electrical systems. So Chris His presentation isn't going to be focused specifically on electrical per se, but this is just one small example of how this scale up with such a huge competency gap, we're going to be running into an area of risk and of problems. And the simple part that we're wanting to present today is to raise this awareness around the urgent need that we have to close this competency gap. And Chris is going to share with us some thoughts and ideas that he's gained over his years of experience of what we can do to try and close this gap. So with that, I'll keep quiet, and Chris, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Angus, and thanks for Ben for helping with the slides and going through. And if I ask you to skip forward and back, that'll be great as we go through. So thanks, Scanware, for inviting me along to give the presentation today. I said we've got about 30 or so minutes or so, and we'll make sure we've got a good sort of 15-20 minutes hopefully at the end for some Q&A, and again a little bit of experimentation of how we're going to do it. Today's very much not about me, but just to give you a little bit of context and background about myself. I've been in a health and safety role for over 35 years, early career in engineering, construction, manufacturing sectors, a period of time in a legal and consulting environment, but effectively for the last 15 years, I've been in the wind and renewable energy sector. In terms of some of the sort of organisations I work with and have worked for, so again, today I'm very much an independent, so I'm not affiliated with any particular part of the supply chain, although I do provide a lot of work for OEMs, developers, consultancies, etc. So I'm here under my sort of training consultancy brand, sort of Renewable Safety. In my previous role, and that's really where I took on a national responsibility for the wind turbine safety rules, was as Director of Health and Safety at Renewable UK. And just to confirm, my, shall we say, technical competence is principally around health and safety. So I'm a Chartered Fellow of the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And in terms of my technical, shall we say, experience, I currently sort of sit on the two significant IEC committees, one on wind turbine and the other is on energy storage. And my main specialism there tends to be around the sort of the health and safety issues. Today, in terms of giving you a little context, so I'm very much focusing at a sector and company level and project level. I'm not drilling down into the micro detail of how to deal with every aspect of competency assessment or into some of the sort of the more detailed technical areas of electrical safety, albeit we're very much going to be using the role of the SAP and how we provide assurance as to SAP competence a little bit later in the presentation. The only thing I didn't mention, I think Angus didn't mention, in addition to the slides, that we won't push it onto you, but there will be an additional support PDF document which will go with this presentation. So if anyone wants any more detailed information around the content of today, that will be available, but I'll leave that for Angus and Ben to work out any of the logistics around that going forward. Okay, next slide, please, Ben. So in terms of what I'm going to go through over the next sort of 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes or so. So really is a bit of context setting. Angus has already given us a little bit of a grounding in terms of the massive energy transition. There's one more bullet to Ben in terms of we're going to go through over the coming years and things like that. I'm then going to look at developing competence as a general construct of how and why we need to, and what the essential elements we need to be considering in developing a competency management system and developing competency at a sector and company level. And I'm going to sort of then drill in a little bit of detail around the role of the senior authorised person role and the assurance processes we hopefully will need to have in place. Many organisations are already doing these things anyway, but if not, what we're trying to do is trying to encourage or at least provide a framework into which people can benchmark their own particular organisational capability. And then I've got a very much a personal view. I've got a very closing almost statement of comment is we need to develop the infrastructure. It's all very well saying we've got these competency gaps, but we as an industry and we globally need to make sure we create the opportunities by which we can provide practical support to enable us to develop the competency needs we need, particularly in safety critical roles, which absolutely the role of the SAP and all those other relevant safety critical roles we need to be addressing. Obviously, we've got that Q&A session towards the end. Next slide, Ben. Okay, so firstly, my little bit of embarrassment, even though I'd been dealing with sort of health and safety for probably by then about sort of 20, 25 years by then, when I took over a role in having oversight of the wind turbine safety rules. And just for clarity, the wind turbine safety rules are a safe system of work for dealing with the low voltage systems within a wind farm wind turbine situation. And when I looked at the rules and I read them many, many times, and even though I was very familiar with permit systems, procedures, policies, all of these things, it was probably the first time I'd really drilled into safety rule sets in any great detail. And what I realized after several weeks and several months is I was overly complicating the rules. And it was only when someone really sort of nudged me and sort of gave me a few pointers around the practicalities of the rules and seeing them work in practice, did I really sort of nail, in certainly my own point of view, of how any rule sets, they are that safe system of work to achieve safety from the system. And if we always come back to those core principles, then all of the other building blocks in terms of the technical safety, competency safety, should always be ending up such that we end up with that safe system of work. Because if we don't end up with that safe system of work, with competent people executing that work, then we're going to be potentially running into the incidents that Angus has already mentioned a little bit earlier. Next slide, please. So just a quick feedback, some excellent seminars and webinars being put on by Scanware, and I don't want to repeat anything we've done previously, but there's a tiny bit of overlap in some of the actual sort of content and approach we saw in the ESP Resilience Model. I think that was back in either July and August, but certainly one of the last ones. So I think that's probably available, or if you've registered that one. So I'd say this hopefully would dovetail into that, because many of those were looking at what a company was doing and how they were approaching some of these practical elements. And I'm probably just lifting that to the next level up and seeing, well, what do we need to be doing at a sector, more broader approach to ensure that we can, shall we say, deal with many of these competence and technical safety gaps going forward. Next slide. So first, and again, Angus has already given a little bit of the game away in terms of some fantastic numbers coming through, enormous numbers. But I think I just want to broaden it even beyond wind to recognise that globally, the energy transition is going to go through a sea change over the coming years and decades ahead. I've stolen this quote effectively from the Wall Street Journal, where effectively, in terms of this energy transition, we're going to see, in effect, the electrification of almost every part of what we encounter, both domestically, through our infrastructure, through our transportation, and through obviously the industrial scale application we're going to see. So any and everything around electrical safety, electrical design, electrical operation is going to be absolutely front and center over the coming years and decades ahead. So there's some really, really impressive numbers. If you want to drill into that, then please do at a later date. Next slide. Again, lots of others supporting in terms of there. So remember, I'm not here to go through the whole climate change and the net zero commitments we have over the coming years and decades ahead. But the key thing is we've got all of these transitions in terms of the need to move to net zero around buildings, around transport, around industry, electricity, heat. And all of those are driving us down the need for competent people to carry out these roles, especially around the areas I'm interested in, which is electricity and the industrial applications of our renewable energy sector. So all of the direction of travel is going up in terms of numbers of people, in terms of the technical competencies we're going to need to support, should we say, the design, construction, installation, operation and maintenance of all these particular systems. Angus has already mentioned the GWEC and GWEC report, so that figure of 568,000. We're going to need, just in wind, another 557 gigawatts of installed capacity over the next 4 to 5 years. Interestingly, even though my slight focus today is around offshore wind, 87%, apologies, of that is going to be onshore, not offshore, in a global capacity. So that's 13% offshore. And in terms of looking at those who come from a global point of view, probably 2/3 of all of that growth is going to be in the Asia Pacific and the APAC regions, whatever. There's still phenomenal growth in the European and the UK markets as well, but the overwhelming speed and scale of that growth we are going to see really in the Asian markets and the America and Pacific markets there. So the headlines, big numbers, big demand, big expectation, but also remember, this is a competitive marketplace in terms of wanting access to these new and developing skills. So we in the energy sector are going to be competing with other sectors to gain access to these people with all of these technical skills. Jump ahead, Ben. So just to give a bit of context about where do we see some of these particular opportunities in the slightly more technical or practical areas. So again, my personal interest is predominantly around wind and energy storage, overwhelmingly wind. So we're going to see a massive growth, obviously, around onshore, offshore, and don't forget all the floating wind offshore we're going to expect to see in the years ahead. But we've got all of the other supporting infrastructure, grid, cables, interconnectors. We're getting these new technologies in terms of HVDC connections and interconnections in offshore wind, solar, energy storage, multiple different types of storage systems coming onto the market. And one of the growing areas of interest is around the opportunities around green hydrogen. And in terms of the practical application and demand, again, reinforcing, we're going to need technical people with competencies covering every aspect in terms of the design, the construction, the commissioning, and the operation and maintenance. And I should really add, because we're starting to decommission wind farms, in terms of decommissioning, and actually some of the most significant risks in wind farms comes at that decommissioning stage. It's often forgotten, but it's a really important one. We're obviously talking about HV and LV assets, and I'm not going to go through a technical, shall we say, compare and contrast between the two. Both have very substantial risk of causing you serious injury and harm, but we do tend to sort of differentiate between people, especially in terms of their roles and competencies in an HV setting and an LV setting, noting my primary area of interest has been around the wind turbine safety rules, which is largely there or primarily there to do with our low voltage electromechanical system. So we're going to need to people have that underpinning technical understanding, safety understanding of how we're going to achieve safety from that electromechanical system, as well as technical knowledge around switching, around RISIP, that's the record of inter-system safety precautions, around cross-boundary work, whatever. So lots of these technical disciplines, we're going to need highly competent, highly able people to actually fulfill those roles. Cables, big issue in obviously wind, and we're going to need to have problem solvers. We're going to have specialists who have that technical and underpinning knowledge who can deal with some of the electrical mechanical problems we're going to encounter in terms of fault prevention, detection, and all the other capabilities to solve those, hopefully prevent, but if not prevent, solve those particular problems. So that really is hopefully just giving a little bit of context of how we've got a massive growth, massive demand, and that demand is especially around some of these technical competencies, of which electromechanical competencies is going to be one of those core areas we're going to need many more people. So we need a system and a process to enable that to happen. Next slide. So what we're looking at here is, therefore, I'm just talking more generally now of getting us to look at how do we approach looking at developing competence. So next slide. So again, actually sort of Angus has probably given a better definition than I would here. This is actually my definition, but again, I won't repeat this slide that Angus mentioned earlier. Basically, it's critical. We need to have many more people, so we need to enhance the skills and competence in terms of driving the skills agenda going forward. So we need a much more proactive and robust approach to actually getting this. It won't happen by chance. We will only get the people in the roles if we collectively as an industry drive it forward. It's not something we can just allow on simple free market economics to work. It needs to be stimulated. It needs to be pushed. Next slide. Can you drill down all of these? So again, obviously I'm going to be biased a little bit in terms of the UK, but just want to reinforce of how most legal systems will have some requirement ensuring people are informed, instructed, trained and supervised. and in a slightly different context, that they have the necessary skills, knowledge, experience. Sometimes we also talk about organizational capability. It's very interestingly and very strangely, even though we talk about competence, in the UK, there's very little that actually formally defines competence under health and safety law. It's all but non-existent. However, in practical terms, that is what we want people to do. We want people to have the necessary, in a way, skills, knowledge, experience underpinned by the relevant information, instruction and training. In terms of practical steps, I think it's important to recognise how training is just a building block. We need to see competence as a process, not as a fixed destination. If anyone says they are competent in one sense, they're probably not, because we all have to go through that continuous improvement, our lifelong learning. There's always something new and additional we can learn. Also, it's vital we take into account, and that's one of the building or the key points I've taken on from some of these seminars, webinars, but also talking with clients, is how we have to also reflect the jurisdictional cultural issues when we're determining how we approach competency managers. And we absolutely then have to apply the principles and practice at a project site and company level. We can't just have a generic corporate system. We have to adapt and apply it and implement it at that site and project level. We do that, for example, in the wind turbine safety rules, by the use of what we call management instructions, to make sure how the theory and the principles and the policies are there enacted practically at that site and project level. Next slide, please. And again, obviously the individual. So I don't want to go through, this is not an academic theory session today, but I do just want to sort of re-emphasize how there are a lot of academic educational models out there. I happen to like the 70-20-10 rule. And what I'm really reinforcing today is, yes, coursework qualifications are a baseline building block, but we only genuinely end up by people becoming competent in their role for their area of responsibility when we can ultimately give them practical, hands-on, real and challenging assignments. And that's absolutely critical when I come on to looking at actually the role and responsibility in terms of individuals with an SAP status. Next slide, please. In terms of training competence, again, this is our typical building block. So we need to make sure it's relevant to the location, that we've got knowledge of the task-specific application of that people have got that experience, they know their own limitations, and above all, it is refreshed. I think as an industry, we're very good at the baseline training, but what I'm trying to emphasize is we need to develop also people's soft skills, and also we need to reflect when people have safety critical roles, especially those who are working in an SAP, an electrical mechanical environment, then we need to develop and more formalize those additional skills and capabilities necessary to support that particular role and activity they're carrying out. Next slide, please, Ben. And again, just before we come on to a quick poll, what I want to do there, and that's your cue, Ben, whatever. I'm just speaking now personally. We too often regard training as a tick box approach. I've got more details in the article if people want to refer there. From a personal point of view, we need to be referring to training and developing people's competencies as an investment. We need to look at it from a risk-based point of view. We need to make sure it is hands-on. So we are, especially when we're dealing with new technical equipment, new wind-specific equipment, people need hands-on experience with the real equipment we're going to be asking them to use. Let's use support systems out there. So we've got growing opportunities with things like AI to help us, and make sure it's relevant. Make sure, I too often see generic training which is not relevant to the particular role and activity. And additional, make sure you know your trainer. Make sure you get your workforce involved in the developing of the training and the competency there. Let's make sure we measure outputs. And really, two important final points. Think about skills fade. We can lose those safety critical skills very quickly if we're not using them. So think about that. But also, let's treat training as a positive output, adding value to the project and site. So, do you get it, Paul? well, Angus made comment on that later, but if those results are fair, that's pretty damn good. I'm very impressed. I think 43% is actually probably better than I was expecting. But again, I think key thing there is in terms of looking at putting a system in place, then we need to have a formal system that has the relevant, robust level of oversight to make sure it all works. So fantastic, Ben, if you want to move on. So there'll be more details in the handout, but I want to do really for the final sort of 10 minutes or so is just give a generic approach in terms of how and why we would look to put into place an assurance system which would aim to get the level of competency we need for the selection of SAPs or even APs to a certain degree in a particular role we're asking to carry out. Next slide. So firstly, reinforcing, I'm looking this only from a UK point of view. And even though there are no legal definitions, there are multiple sources I've just drawn on, for example, the ENA, the Energy Network reference here. So there are various definitions that are described and listed in model safety rules, and many organizations will probably use those as their default benchmark in terms of determining the level of competence and authorization people may wish to have. Next slide, please. And again, today is not a legal lecture, but just to reinforce some of the earlier principles I mentioned earlier, how even though competence is not explicitly referred to, most of the relevant health and safety legislation, and obviously the most relevant to the presentation today, the electricity at work regulations, is going to talk about people who have the relevant technical knowledge and experience to carry out those particular roles. So they have to have possess the knowledge and experience and as necessary, the level of supervision to carry out the relevant work accordingly. So even though the word competence is there, all the principles and practice in determining someone becoming competent are underpinned by the relevant legal standards. And it's highly likely in your own jurisdictions, if you're not UK based, there's going to be an equivalent benchmark in terms of legal assessment of competence you can draw on. Next system. So my first sort of comment generally in terms of my, should we say, almost like day job, when I'm looking at things like competency assessment, looking at management systems, looking at compliance, is to make sure that the system is integrated as part of your company health and safety management system. It's not pushed sideways. It's not just an add-on extra. It has to be clearly and fully integrated. And it was a noticeable change in the UK when we changed the wind turbine safety rules, actually now a number of years ago, but we made that much more explicit of how you need to make sure any and all of your rule sets and your competency assurance processes need to be fully dovetailed into your own health and safety and wider risk management systems. So we need clarity in terms of what rule sets are being applied, how you are going to undertake your own training needs assessment, how it links into your risk assessment processes, what are your authorization processes, but it needs to be backed up with other support systems. Yes, it will take time and money, so it needs to be properly resourced in terms of manpower and very occasionally, should we say, fixed costs as well. But you also need to be talking to people, talking to your customers, talking to your supply chain to make sure your outputs, your expectations, your requirements are communicated to those in need. It's not something they have to guess. And as with all health and safety systems, don't assume it works. It needs to be regularly audited and regularly reviewed to make sure it remains suitable, compliant, and fit for purpose according to your risk profile and your project activities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the role of an SAP, I'm not going to go through in micro detail, but I just want to really highlight one particular point there on the slide there, is how this is where it perhaps differs from, shall we say, other more general roles we may encounter in health and safety, of how the designation does not automatically transfer between employers and projects. That is because the systems, the implementation is a company and project level, and obviously the technology we are asking people to work on, whether that's the switchgear, the transformers, whatever they are quite likely to be different, or certain aspects of them are different. So we need to make sure people are competent in those very specific areas. Next slide, please. So I've sort of broken it down into two chunks. And again, more detail in the handout we can give here of how when we are looking at recruiting, selecting and keeping and maintaining the competence of an SAP, then yes, we're always going to be using the building blocks of their qualifications, what knowledge do they have, what relevant and practical experience, and also their relevant soft skills, their personal capabilities and competencies in terms of being able to, say, carry out that role. Do they command, respect from their colleague? Are they able to challenge management when they disagree with them, perhaps on cost grounds or safety grounds? So they've got those underpinning competencies. Personal view, certainly the SIPs and the organisations, I think usually we're fairly good at this. I'm not saying universally, but certainly what I've seen, most of the SAPs I come across very definitely tick these boxes. Next slide, please. But my next point is to how it's not just about a box ticking exercise to make sure people have those baseline competencies, the qualifications, the experience, but we need a system. We need a management system. We need support systems to make sure that those SAPs and the supporting systems around them are maintained and kept up to date. So in terms of a few of those I'm going to pick up, which is relevant to perhaps the wind sector, how are you going to keep them updated in terms of the local project updates? And again, it does differ depending whether that SAP is fully in-house, of whether we contracted that role to a third party, or whether we perhaps brought in independents to help us fulfill those particular roles. So it will vary subtly depending whether it's an in-house model, a contracted in model, or perhaps we've brought individuals. But the basic principle is it's not just about doing the initial tick box. We need the system to keep people up to date. They need to have, for example, access. Are we giving them access to the relevant instant data? Are you giving them access? In the UK, we have a system through the ENA called the NEDA system. So are we giving them that opportunity and access to all of those updates and technical information? Are they getting proper site familiarization in terms of the hardware that they're being asked to actually operate on? Are they, particularly if they're an SAP and they've come from another sector, are they giving the proper sector-specific training and familiarization to enable them to carry out and fulfill that particular role? Next slide, please. So just starting to draw to a close in terms of timings there. So again, I think in terms of the headlines, in terms of I think these are hopefully some of the themes I've sort of very rapidly sort of picked up in here. Companies, you need to be very, very clear about what and how you have communicated. Firstly, there need to be some robust rules in place, but they're properly communicated to those who need to know it. You need a robust process of compliance to make sure that you are compliant and meeting both the technical requirements and legal requirements, that you've got a robust process of selection. So there is a process by which you can verify and provide assurance in terms of the competence and the appointment of those particular individuals in those defined roles. And something which was pointed out to me fairly recently, many of these processes will go through an authorization panel, but have we given training to the authorization panel? We're very clear that we need to have trained and competent people, but sometimes I'm getting occasional feedback of how the panel themselves don't necessarily have the underpinning knowledge in some of the technical areas they're being asked to provide assurance on. Obviously, we will always look at their experience, their skills, and their ability to be able to communicate, communication, and underpinning all of this, we need to make sure that the organization has a competency assurance processes which we've audited. We need to verify that it is working effectively. Final couple of slides, I think, Ben, before I think we're moving on towards. So this is just a very first, it's one final sort of slide, I think, in terms of, just want to make a couple on. Next slide, please. In helping us out, I think business as usual is not going to work. If we are going, and I'm not looking at this just from a wind point of view, albeit I'm very clearly biased to the wind sector, but I think in terms of the need for having many more individuals in these technical specialist roles, especially around the SAP role, we are going to need to create more training centres and hubs where people can have access and have hands-on experience with the technology, the HV technology in particular, we are going to be asking people to work on. Even though I'm happy to sort of take it on the chin, there's good and bad in this, I do think there are opportunities for improvements in HV training standardization. Yes, I've been very clear. Key elements are not transferable from project to project, but I think there are many areas that clearly are transferable. So I think we need a little bit of flexibility or common sense in seeing which areas can we standardize and which areas can we actually remain in terms of being company and project specific. And I think there's also opportunities, especially around my comment there in terms of the authorization panels. Could there be an opportunity to provide a bit of innovation around perhaps a new approach to authorization panels, where we've got perhaps individuals who are very experienced, for example, SAP, but they can be that resource that can help across multiple organizations, and that provides us an additional capability and resource to get more people through the authorization process. Because I have come across a number of situations whereby those panels, the lack of panels and lack of competency to sit on those panels can be a bottleneck to get enough people going through the particular process. I think we're pretty close to where we need to be. Just to see where we are, Ben. Yeah, just an acknowledgement. So again, thanks for some of the stuff today. Again, we've got a handout which will be available after today's session. That's the sort of a copy of the document there, but it's about a sort of an 8-page document which goes into much more detail, very much a whistle stop fly through some principles today. If you want to drill into a bit more detail in some of the things I've gone through, most of the information will be in that document, but I'll really hand you back to Angus to facilitate the last sort of 15 or so minutes.
Thank you, Chris. Very much appreciated. If it's all right, quickly before we move on to the open forum, as it were, a number of questions that have come through. One was about your approach, our approach being quite UK centric. To what degree should this be applied internationally? But I don't know what your thoughts are, Chris, but I think
very, very quick answer again. So I think actually with really nearly every area of health and safety, yes, there will be technical and regulatory differences wherever you are globally. And obviously you need to be mindful of whatever the local code is, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia. But I think in terms of the importance of having a competency management approach, a system to ensure that you can firstly determine what levels of competency you need, and then you have a process to back that up, I think is consistent wherever you are. So yeah, no doubt about it at all. Certainly in the terms of the principles today, almost TIPEX out UK, I would like to think most of those principles are relevant to wherever you are in the globe.
Which is why the GWO, for example, are creating training courses in standardization which can be applied internationally.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're building blocks, so they will hopefully provide us with the essential building blocks. Yes, there will always be the need to adapt and apply. Are there any country specific needs that we need to top up? Absolutely. And obviously the technology itself, are there any specifics that we need to adapt at a particularly, so we say, technology level? But I would say 80-90% of the core principles are going to be universal wherever you are globally.
That's very good. I've appointed a competent high voltage provider, including the use of their SAPs. Do I need to do anything else?
Yes, you need to. So yes, if they are a competent HV provider, that may tick all the boxes you need practically to execute what works you need and what roles you need. But you, as with all health and safety, you cannot contract that out. You cannot contract the responsibilities out. So you need to have a level of due diligence in their appointment to confirm that they are the level of competence you want them to be, and they have the relevant systems and support arrangements in place. And in addition, that you are periodically checking that they are delivering what you've asked them to carry out on your behalf. So you can't just write the contract and ignore it. Make sure they're competent in the first place. And when you have appointed them, then you need a process to periodically to review and provide assurance they're delivering what you expect them to do.
That's very good. And furthermore, a point out to the audience is that Scanwell as an organisation, I would say we're extremely well connected to various professionals within the particular electricity sector globally. We're working in 82 different countries. And so if ever anyone is needing some kind of pointer as to who they could talk to maybe run through what their current contractor assessment process procedures are, particularly when it comes to high voltage, which often safety professionals are sometimes a little bit scary about because it's quite a detailed area and they maybe prefer to leave everything with the contractor. But it's really important you have your own contractor competency assessment policy procedure document that you work through. And I'd say we could put you in touch with a number of people who would be more than happy to jump on virtually for half an hour to share their views on what you may already have and or share some tips and tricks as to what you could use and or adopt to help you with that assessment process. Another question here is about, I'm an experienced HV practitioner. What additional renewable energy knowledge do I need? Well, if you're looking to pivot into the renewable energy sector, there will be people queuing at your door to take you on because there is a huge gap at the moment when it comes to high voltage practitioners, engineers within the industry. So I don't know, you can answer more specifically, Chris.
No, I think in terms of, the underpinning, if you are already an SAP working in grid or other infrastructure or whatever, then you're going to have the core underpinning knowledge, which is highly relevant and transferable into the wind sector. Clearly, the point I'm making is you will need to be given the opportunity to be given access to and get familiarization with the particular bits of kit you are going to be asked to be able to, so we say, provide assurance over. Now, that will be a discussion between you and the company, you and the technology organization, whatever. But I think Angus is very clear. If you've got that level of experience, there will be significant opportunities for you in the market. Exactly.
And all you need to do really, and if you're struggling to try and connect with an organization that's looking for these kind of people, reach out to us. But there's plenty of exposure online of companies looking for such people. And typically they will provide you with the necessary basics you need to go offshore, for example, and climb to be able to do your work from an electrical perspective. One thing I think is really important to recognize, the wind energy industry, a challenge is, if we take the utilities network around any country in the world, they have a distribution electricity network on their doorstep. And they have the luxury of having SAPs, for example, working in offices who can go out to a particular network, make an isolation, go back to the office, and the people can do their work. You cannot have that on an offshore wind farm. You can't send an SAP out to one turbine to create an isolation and then back to his office while the engineers conduct the work. So when we say an area of risk, we are needing multi-skilled individuals. And often you may have an individual that only has the scantest of training, sometimes undertaking quite high risk activities because there is no one else to be able to do that. They can only have a finite number of people going out to conduct activities on a turbine. When will we see a standardized set of HV safety rules for companies to build upon within the UK? Will there be requirements as to what we would expect in the UK in terms of auditing and checking of competencies? Will this also include a process in the event of an incident in terms of retraining and removal of SAP AP status for a standardized period of time?
If that's an open question to me in terms of there. So having been involved in writing standards and industry groups, whatever, in one sense, certainly the HV, the ENA provides a very good, they are providing accessible common rule sets, whatever. Obviously in the wind sector, it's something I'd give it as a little bit of a success story. The wind turbine safety rules in the UK for the LV system have been going for over 20 years now. So they're pretty much tried and tested, certainly in the UK and Ireland. And interestingly, we're seeing many companies starting to use a version of those by removing the sort of the UK elements within it on their particular projects there. So I don't think tomorrow morning we're going to suddenly magically get a single universal standard that everyone is going to drop into. But we do have those templates, particularly for HV around ENA, which we can draw on and use on. If I'm honest, I don't think that's actually a big challenge at the industry. My issue is more having the competent people to take those rule sets and those standards and then to implement and apply those practically and proportionally. It's a word I haven't used so far today, but I want to highlight it. A lot of it is proportionate. So it needs to be risk-based according to the nature of the particular site, project, and the risk profile of the assets on that particular project. Obviously, when we're talking about HV, it's always going to have a very significant potential. So what I'm being very clear of, just because you're a small project, we're not saying you need a lower standard.
That's good.
there's always a minimum that's a safe level. It's just with a larger project, we may have a slightly more sophisticated approach.
Very good. So, Ben, if you move on to the next slide, I think it just sets out the question. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do here, okay, is mainly through the line of engagement, is there a shared concern as to competency? And I'd say that whether it's in wind or not, we made a particular lean on wind, and what do you think should be done? So, Ben, I'm not too sure I've ever done this before, so I know it's possible, so I'm afraid the audience will have just to bear with us, but I don't know if anyone wants to venture to stick up their hand with, even if it's not a question, some advice, some suggestion, something you've got to share. We'd love to unmute you and love to hear it. And Ben, I'm not too sure that I can undo the unmuting part. Maybe you can do it from your side if someone ventures.
I'll give it a go. I'll do it.
So don't be shy. It'd be good to hear from you.
We've got our first person, Nathan.
Go for it, Nathan. Welcome back from Oktoberfest.
Thanks very much, Angus. Just about recovering now. We actually discussed this. I was at a conference yesterday with Wind Energy Ireland, and a few ideas come up. One idea that came up that is used in multiple other industries is a type of logbook for the likes of technicians and other professionals within the wind industry. And they're basically issued with a logbook whenever they first start work within the industry, and they carry this throughout their time while they're working in the wind industry. So there's pros and cons of it, of course. Will it be adopted by all operators and so on, or will this be something that they sort of go against? But it's certainly an idea, and it's a way of sort of recording competency, training, further development, a bit like what other, for example, for our health and safety, we always sort of maintain a PDD and so on. It'll be something along those lines for other wind industry personnel.
I think that's excellent.
Interesting. Just so we never formalised it, but when we did a revision to wind turbine safety rules a few years ago, and we put together the sort of core training at the beginning of the actual workbook, we actually created a series of log templates where people could record the sites, the project, the assets they'd worked on, such that they could effectively build up that. So on a personal basis, I would strongly, if you are, particularly if you're self-employed, particularly if you, obviously most of us have to maintain some level of CPD in terms of maintain our professional qualifications, irrespective of there being an industry formal logbook to record, I would strongly encourage we do that anyway. My only comment would be who would be the, should we say, the custodian of should we say, what needs to be that logbook, and to what degree are they then going to be subsequently either used and or checked, whatever. And I need to be very careful the way I phrase this is there has been, and I'm going many years back, there have been situations in other industries whereby there can be a risk of falsification, and should we say, all I'm saying is there can be challenges there. I'm not suggesting that the winder is a specific answer, but we do have emerging technology platforms which would be able to provide evidence of your technical qualifications and potentially the ability to upload, this is the project. So yeah, I think certainly from the wind point of view, my suggestion would be that would be best. People like Safety On and G+ would be best placed to start looking at those things. But even if they don't, I think as a basic principle, it's an excellent idea.
That's excellent. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Nathan. I'm going to bump you off now.
Go for it, Daniel. Daniel, it's over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
you well.
Okay, very good. Yeah, one of the things I've done as an authorising officer for SAPs and APs in the past as well is when you first authorise somebody to carry out operations at a certain voltage, you make sure that as part of the authorisation process, they carry out their first switching activities under the watchful eye of an authorised person or a senior authorised person who's been competent for a long time. So basically, as part of the authorisation requirements, is you make sure that they maybe carry out 4 or 5 switching operations at the voltage that they're authorised to do so, plus also make sure that they carry out the issue so many permits of works or safety documents that's required. And only when you've assessed the actual practical ability do they actually get the authorization, because it's a big difference between being, let's say, a passenger in a car and being the driver in a car. It's a big step up sometimes. And that's how we make sure as well on the projects I've worked on that the authorization process is quite robust.
Daniel, I think that's excellent. How do you manage a situation if a particular client, for example, is bringing a contractor in? Because I think what's important to note on this one, you're probably familiar with this, because there is such a finite resource of competent SAPs or SAPs, APs, you find a lot of them are freelance, self-employed, and they go from project to project to project to project doing these kind of work. And the project owner, project manager, yeah, I'm probably not explaining myself too clearly, but how do you manage it from a contractor perspective, or how would you recommend?
Okay, yeah. So obviously there's the first stage is the review of the experience of the CVs, making sure that they have some form of switching experience in the past. Then we have quite an intense training session that involves scenarios, question papers, interviews, and of course practical training on the equipment that they will be asked to be authorized for. That's followed by the authorization panel, and obviously there's quite a bit of time in between each where they can study the particular model of safety rules that's required. And then when they're set to work, obviously then they have what I just mentioned before, which is the guidance offshore or onshore, wherever they may be, carrying out switching operations under the watchful eye of an experienced senior authorized person. So it's a 3-month, 6-month process. It doesn't happen overnight. It can take quite some time. But by doing that, we make sure we build that into the project plans to make sure by the time everybody is authorized, what we are left with is a
Yeah, I think we
lost him.
I think we lost him, but I think we got fundamentally the points there in terms of, yeah, I mean, I fully concur with that, Angus, in terms of there. I think the challenge is with the contractor, we can't just take at face value the CV they send us in, no matter how impressive. So there does need to be that overlap and dovetailing between the company doing the relevant verification and assurance processes. What we don't want to do is completely 100% duplicating everything. So we need to get a level of proportionality in terms of how much can we assess in terms of the evidence they provided and the other checks and due diligence we do, to obviously sampling the actual technical checks. And that is a bit of a catch-22. If we're too flexible, then we potentially have gaps. But if we are too rigid, then we don't then get the number of people going through this process as we might ideally want.
Yeah, that's good. I think it's excellent what Daniel's brought in there. I think we've got our next panelist, Ben, for our next speaker. It sounds like they have a good process. I think we've got time for a few more. If anyone else wants to stick their virtual hand up. I think it's excellent learning from the experiences of various ones that are on.
Brilliant.
Well, I think, Ben, if we reach to the end, there's I think we will close and round up. Give one last shout out if anyone wants to raise a hand to share any practical suggestions, tips on what we can do to ensure a greater level of competency. The key thing, of course, is safety. Well, we'll close and round up. So I'd like to thank every single one of you for attending. It's been an excellent experience having you all on. And I'm sorry that Stephen Rose wasn't able to be on to share some of his experiences from a commissioning perspective within SSE. But it's Chris, really appreciate your participation and sharing what you've got. And there'll be further webinars between now and the end of the year as part of Electrical Safety Series. And if you want to be put down to be included to receive the invites of those, and you can let Ben know. I think you should all have Ben's contact details. And with that, I'm going to wish you all an excellent day. And thank you for joining in. Thanks for supporting the mission of saving lives.